involved in reporting on MLMs through a show that I host and produce called The Dream. It's a podcast. You can find it on iTunes very easily. Our first season and then a bunch of bonus episodes were focused really strictly on MLMs. And it's kind of a narrative nonfiction show. It's not like a newsy, two people in a room talking kind of thing. We tell the whole story of the world of MLMs, where they came from, how they still exist, what happens next. And I'm also writing a book called Selling the Dream that's based on that first season. I personally grew up around MLMs. So when this idea came up in our offices, I was like, what? This isn't a story. There's nothing to, this is just what people do, right? And then the second we started diving in, I was like, oh, when you find out that the thing you grew up with is different from everyone else, like that your family does something weird. It was kind of that moment where it was like, oh, not everyone's mom is a Tupperware lady. I didn't know that. So it was a fun perspective to come into it with, and we're still reporting. Yeah.
Okay. Lisette, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Lisette Voitko. I am a wealth reporter at Forbes magazine, which means I cover billionaires and the world's richest people. And that does include some people who have started and run MLMs themselves. In terms of how I got interested in multi-level marketing as a story, I was at Columbia J School in 2018 and on a reporting trip in Queens. There was a man on the street handing out little flyers for Herbalife. And I was very intrigued, and I was on assignment, so I needed a story. So I decided to follow him into his nutrition club. And I was in there, and I was very kind of taken aback by how kind of not corporate the location seemed, given what I had known about Herbalife. And kind of like Jane Marie said, once I started diving into it, I was like, this is mind blowing that this is something that exists. And so I did extensive reporting on Herbalife for my master's thesis at Columbia, which is a long-form journalism project. And then while I've been with Forbes, I've continued that MLM reporting in terms of lawsuits filed against different MLMs for consumer protection issues. I've also covered former President Donald Trump's involvement in the past with MLMs. And most recently, I wrote a long form feature for Forbes about how the founders of Rodin and Fields lost their billionaire status. So that's kind of where I've arrived in terms of my reporting. Thanks.
Okay. And Liz, would you like to go next?
Sure. Just had to unmute myself. So I'm Liz Day. I'm currently a senior story editor at the New York Times, working on our documentary series, The New York Times Presents. And before that, I was a senior producer at John Oliver, where back in 2016, I pitched and reported and produced a segment on multi-level marketing. Which funnily enough, I think that we aired the Sunday right before the 2016 election, because we figured, all the polls show the election is going to be uneventful, and that turned out to be wrong. But you can check out the segment on YouTube. I think it was around 30 minutes, and I just rewatched it this morning to remind myself of this world, and it's got, I was really shocked that it has 27 million views, which is really surprising, and a very cool thing about working at John Oliver was the type of reach that we were able to get. And I was also just super entertained to dive back into this world. We did the piece back in 2016, and I've kept up with MLMs passively, but not actively. So I'd forgotten so much bonkers stuff about this world. We'd featured a clip of Madeleine Albright shilling for Herbalife, and one MLM that produced a commercial where a puppy regained the ability to walk due to its magical juice that it was selling, and all sorts of stuff. So I was very entertained to go back into that world. And then before I was at John Oliver, I worked at ProPublica, the investigative reporting nonprofit, and have always just kind of had gravitated towards business stories and power and wealth, and wanting to follow the money and kind of understand those types of stories. And I had long been interested in MLMs, just kind of from growing up around them. It sounds like others. No one in my family had ever participated in one, but I remember, a friend up the street's mom sold Avon, or, my best friend in college bought a crate of Mary Kay that she was convinced, I'm going to now do this as a career. And then I kind of forgot about them. And then in the last 10 years or so, really started to notice a resurgence of MLMs, particularly on my Facebook feed. I would see, people I went to high school with posting about this new business opportunity, and trying to recruit people. And I thought, this could be really interesting to do an episode on for the show. And not only like, what are these, and let's use our platform for consumer awareness, but also like more philosophically of why did these things endure? Why are MLMs like still around?
Thank you. And Casey, we would love to hear from you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Casey. I'm a long time reporting on MLMs back in 2019 when I was working full-time for HuffPost. Like Liz, I had noticed this uptick in casual Facebook friends suddenly selling leggings and nail art and that sort of stuff, inviting me to these private groups. And I remembered that actually that fabulous John Oliver segment, that was kind of my introduction to the concept of MLMs originally. And so I knew that this was potentially problematic, but I wanted to explore it more and figure out why are all my friends, particularly women, particularly moms, a lot of teachers, in fact, why are they suddenly so interested in selling for MLMs? And so, I started digging into it, and I wrote this piece called MLMs Are Nightmares for Women and Everyone They Know. And the feedback on that was really surprising. There was a ton of it, both positive and negative. And I figured that would be an interesting kind of niche beat to start pursuing. So I covered MLMs more for HuffPost, and now I'm freelance writing, and I'm working on a couple of stories for other outlets as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. So the next question, I would love to know what your experience has been, to the extent that you've had one, with the companies, with the people from the companies, whether that means distributors or the companies themselves. So Lisette, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think the most thorough experience I have had is with Herbalife specifically, since that's what my master's thesis was built on. I mentioned that family in Queens that I had built a relationship with. They invited me to an Herbalife recruiting event, which I went to. And so I got to see an aspect of multi-level marketing that I feel if you don't ever get recruited in, you don't get to see. And it was a good experience because it's such an overwhelming experience of being in this gigantic, it was in an event space at a casino that's out by JFK Airport in Queens. And it was like this loud booming music where you could feel the bass reverberating through you. And they have these, high level uplines who are there to, motivationally speak to people, and they're treated like rock stars. And when they come out on the stage, people are begging for autographs. And so, you really get to understand how people can be so easily taken in, by what they're selling, by this promise of, being potentially on that stage one day to tell your own success story and to sell autographs, and, to say nothing of the dubious, income claims and that sort of thing that we're all very well aware of at this point. So, from a consumer standpoint, I thought that was a really good aspect to get exposed to. But in terms of actually dealing with the corporate version of the MLMs, the people who are paid to make sure that the wheels keep turning, they at least in my experience, I'm curious to hear from the other panelists, when you're having to ask them questions, especially awkward things about it's very well known in Herbalife, Mark Hughes had, an alleged drug problem, and having to ask PR people about that. They just take the questions, they may not necessarily answer them, but they were surprisingly overall non-confrontational. And they, you know, kind of give you the standard, you know, spokesperson, PR, you know, babble speak about this, that, and the other thing that they're doing to, you know, improve people's lives and give them opportunities. So it's kind of an interesting duality right there, especially from what I've heard about other participants who I kind of consider victims, but they're also, you know, kind of victimizing other people themselves, trying to recruit them in. But you get the whole gamut, I think, in terms of those who are trying to be more abusive in their power to recruit people in, and those who are not. So that's kind of my abridged experience, you know, participating with MLMs directly.
Okay, and Liz, how about you next?
Yeah, so I also went to a nutrition club for Herbalife, which was a really interesting experience. But I guess what I was most surprised by was interacting with the companies. So as a journalist, you know, when you're doing a segment on an industry and that will heavily focus on, you know, a company like Herbalife, I go in through the front door and contact them, you know, almost at the very start and say, you know, I want to learn more about you and how you operate. And no one answered us, and no one was interested in that front door approach. But what I was more surprised by was, you know, we also then, right before publication or airing the piece, we send a very extensive list of questions and claims and basically give a company every opportunity to say, no, you're missing some context, or, hey, that's not accurate, that's not fair for these reasons. And I was really surprised that like no one responded almost at any company. And that's really, really unusual. You know, companies generally, even if it's just to acknowledge receipt of your email or provide a, we're not going to comment, or maybe a statement. No one really did anything like that, which was really surprising. I think the only other time that's happened is with the opioid or the fentanyl manufacturer Incest. And I think when we did a piece on Alex Jones, he just never responded at all. So that was super surprising to me that, you know, no one wanted to engage at all and wanted to defend themselves or wanted to, you know, believed that they were being, that the perception and the allegations and criticism of them were unfair and wanted to engage with that. And no one, was interested in that.
Thank you. Okay, Casey, how about you next?
Yeah, I had a very similar experience reaching out to MLMs that I was covering. You know, in the finance space, when I'm talking about financial institutions, banks, they're always very eager to put their spin on how they're presented, understandably, and very active in that arena. When I was reaching out to MLMs, you know, saying, hey, I'm writing an article, I'm going to be mentioning these kind of sensitive subjects about your company, would you like to provide a statement? Half of them never responded, and the others would just give me kind of a blanket, very basic statement, as if they weren't really too concerned about reputation management. And that leads me to believe, on the other side of things, you know, I have contacted a lot of former and current representatives for MLMs, and they're the ones who tend to be the most vocal about the companies. Even, you know, if we publish something in the comment section, you'll have so many people running to the defense of their MLM right away. And it gives me the sense that these companies know that the bad press exists. They're not going to waste their time trying to combat it because they already have these soldiers on the ground essentially doing that reputation management for them. So I thought that was super interesting and not something I've ever really run across with other types of companies before.
And Jane Marie? I think you're still muted.
Just jumping off of what Liz and Casey said, I had such strange interactions with all of the companies we tried to reach out to. I was pretty shocked that no one came to the defense of their sellers. We had many different sellers that we interviewed on our program, and not one corporate body came to us and said, you know, let us speak about how we actually take care of our members or our downlines, and let us explain how this is really a good thing. I did reach out to, I got in touch with Rodan Fields and Mary Kay, both of them, and Lime Life. They all responded with basically accusing me that I was asking the wrong questions, that people who get involved in MLMs don't get involved to make money, that they only, you know, they don't say why they get involved, but they say, I don't think you understand all the reasons people get involved, so I'm not going to talk to you because you clearly have a misunderstanding of what this whole thing is. People get involved for a variety of reasons. They might want to do it because their friend's doing it. They might want to do it because they're bored on a Saturday. They might want to do it for religious purposes or whatever. So since you're uneducated, I'm not going to help educate you. And I'm also not going to talk to you about this in general. So that was one of the main responses I got. I also got a lot of like, why don't you guess what we're up to kind of answers, where I just really wanted someone on the phone to say, no, that we're doing something great. But the problem with our production, because we were a podcast being released weekly, was that, not the problem with it, I mean, I loved doing it and it's a great show, but the problem on their end was that we were discovering things along the way. Like, I hadn't heard of Lime Life before we started reporting, and the show was coming out as we're reporting. So we heard of this company, and about 4 episodes in, sent someone to one of their training like groups in San Francisco. She had a miserable time. It wasn't all rah. It was like very depressing. People were there to buy heads, like to find out how to make money through Lime Life, to buy headstones for their grandfather, that kind of thing. And we did reach out to them for comment, and they were upset that we hadn't collaborated with them since from the beginning of the project, and therefore didn't have the right perspective on our reporting. And we tried to explain to them that that's not like ethical or possible, because we hadn't heard of their companies before we started reporting. So I had some strange interactions. Not any of the ones I had wished for. We really wanted like a lawsuit or something, like something from someone. But yeah, pretty much people saying you don't know how to do your job as a reporter, so we're not talking to you.
That is very interesting. And thank you for, it is really interesting. I've seen, obviously, some lawsuits have come out, but I guess it kind of just depends on who picks it up. I would really like to hear, after hearing from all of you about kind of your experiences with why you do this, how about what is hard for you about doing this? So what kind of journalistic limitations do you face in reporting on MLMs, whether it's how you do it, what you have to be careful about, challenges that you face, and things like that. So how about Casey, we start with you.
Sure. Definitely one of the big challenges I faced was finding sources who were willing to go on record. There's so many people who are eager to tell the story of essentially how they've been burned by MLMs, how they have impacted their families and friendships negatively. But once you bring up the idea of putting their name to that story, they get scared. There's a lot of fear of retaliation, not but from the companies, but from their friends and family, many of whom are still involved in these companies. And a lot of them are also embarrassed, because once you're out of the situation, looking back, you think, how could I have fallen for this? And, you know, a lot of them convinced their loved ones to get involved, and some of them are still stuck in it. So it's this combination of fear and shame and embarrassment that makes it really tough to get people to go on record and tell their story and agree to have their name used, which obviously is really crucial to writing a story that's going to be published nationally. So.
Okay, and Liz, how about you next?
That's a good question. I know that earlier we had been talking about like, is dumbing things down a challenge? And I didn't see that as a problem because that was one of the blessings of John Oliver working with professional comedians was they were not journalists. They were not like in the weeds and wonky the way that we're like obsessed with unpacking like, how exactly would the FTC regulate this? That's not how they think. They're just, coming at it from like a normal person on the street would. And I think that's really powerful. I think Bob Fitzpatrick might have been the first person that opened our eyes to this, but like the way to explain why this model won't work is like very, very basic and simple math, right? Like one person at the top who recruits 5 people, who they each recruit 5 people. You can only do that 14 cycles and you have taken everyone who is living on Earth, which is like a very beautifully simple way to understand, why as an entire, industry, there are problems here. So I've never really struggled with the like dumbing things down or making it accessible, but instead seen that as like a really powerful tool and a cool challenge. I guess the thing I would say about challenge is getting people to take MLMs and this industry seriously and this issue seriously. I think there's a lot of journalists out there, a lot of financial journalists out there who kind of see this as down market, or I don't know what it is. They must think, oh, well, people know what they're getting into, or for whatever reason, they like don't find this interesting. And I think that's a real shame. And who knows why that is, if it's because like it's predominantly women involved, or it's just an elitist thing versus not knowing anyone who's ever, been involved with one. But that's probably the biggest hurdle I see.
Okay, and Lisette?
Yeah, so to piggyback off of what Casey said about trying to get former distributors, sellers, and sometimes like victims of MLMs to go on the record is really difficult. I've gone so far as to let sources know that if they're truly, whistleblowing on a company, that there are resources out there available to help them, that they're not entirely alone. Even though as a journalist, there's a line that I have to keep between myself and them for ethical purposes. And even that was not helpful enough to get them to go on the record. So I think that the one thing that we should impress upon people listening today is that fear is very real. That I think that having been so squashed, or feeling like they've been so squashed by MLMs, has really resonated with them in a way that's like almost traumatic. And I'd be curious to hear if my fellow panelists have, met anyone else similarly. And then to piggyback off of what Liz was saying, the mathematical scheme of it is a beautifully simple way of explaining how it's just impossible for, from a recruiting standpoint, for these to work. But I think that what Jane Marie did with The Dream, where she was able to delve thoroughly into the history and into the FTC and the legal aspects of it, I think that that's something that's really important for people to know historically. But it's also really difficult to address that in written journalism. And so, I think that one of the things that's limiting is that the format in which you're presenting the story. Written journalism is different than television, is different than podcasting, and they each have their own advantages and disadvantages, and how you can actually unpack everything that you've discovered. So that's something to take into account as well.
I want to do a whole talk on that. Like on how hard it is to translate, things I would want to do in print to audio. Like if it doesn't happen on tape, it didn't happen. So can't use it. There's no do-overs. Sorry.
Well, we would love to hear more on what you think.
Well, so my limitations as a podcaster were there's levels of like how open people want to be with you. And the first level, or the easiest, Liz, that like fight with me on this, and I would love that because I hope to be wrong, but I think the easiest is to get someone on the phone, and that's it, just like, and then write down their words for a print piece. The most difficult is putting a microphone in their face and telling them it's their voice that's going to be out there. And then the next is putting a camera in their face. So it really depends on what medium you're working in, like how open people are willing to be with you. In our experience, I had a very difficult time finding subjects who had experience, but were also neutral, which is why I ended up falling back on my family, because I could like ask them the tough questions and make them be reasonable with me. But most of the people who were willing to talk on the podcast were either former sellers who were very angry and had an agenda, or people who are still involved and very angry and had an agenda. So finding that sweet spot of someone who'd experienced it and just wanted to talk about it was really, really hard for us. And I think like the other thing for reporting that made our jobs really difficult was the lack of data. There's very little, because most of these companies aren't publicly traded. Most of these companies do not encourage good bookkeeping. They have this system of you ask the people at the top, like, what's going on with this accounting? And they pass the buck down to this person who they recruited with the line, you don't have to know anything about accounting. You can do this with no business degree. You can do this with that, And so I'm talking to people where I'm like, well, where's your P&L, your profit and loss statement from last year? And you're like, what? And they don't have to report that to their upline. They don't have to report that to their upline, and they don't have to report that to the company, and the company does that on purpose. So finding actual facts about the flow of money, and recruitment tactics and all of that stuff, it's so secretive. And there's so many intimidation tactics that I found that were used, against people to get them to be quiet. Made it really hard. It's a little bit of a secret society. And so anytime you're kind of diving into that from the outside, it's really difficult, which is why we see many of these, like, not to compare them, but many of these like cult documentaries are made by former members, like Leah Remini and like the Nexium folks and all of that stuff are people who were in there and then came out and told the story. But not having that was really, really hard to find subjects to talk to.
So kind of going off of this topic, you might not all have a response to this, but I was kind of wondering, some of us discussed this the other day when we were meeting to talk about the panel, the idea of trauma-informed reporting and how journalists should interact with the victims. So for anybody who has, and it looks like Jane Marie, you have something to say. So if you want to start, I would really like to hear kind of what your perspectives are on that.
Yeah, those interviews were the ones where I was the most light-footed, obviously, and trying to be, one thing our show tried to do, and I just try to do in my reporting in general, is treat everyone like a human being and not like a sucker. No, we try to have empathy. We don't want anyone to think like they're being judged for a giant corporation roping them into something that sounded really good. So no, there's no shaming. There's no like it. I just tried over and over again to be like, this totally could have and kind of did a couple times happen to me. So like, we're not coming at this from a judgment. There are giant institutions that have forced this trauma upon you, and it's okay. It's okay that you made a mistake, or it is difficult that your family isn't talking to you. I'm in the middle of, personally right now, like I am in the middle of fighting about vaccines with my family, just to bring it into the present, because they're MLM sellers, they're wellness folks, and no one will get a vaccine, so I don't get to see anybody. And I have to say, okay, well, I guess that's, that's you. And that comes from someplace, and I don't want to judge you about it. It's hard, but yeah.
Does anybody else have something that they want to contribute to this question?
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit. So I spent a lot of time with one former Herbalife seller. I even flew across the country to spend a couple days with her. We, at the end of the visit, she burned her old Herbalife vision boards in front of me. It was kind of this like symbolic ending to the whole trip. And even though we spent all that time together, she told me extensively about her experience. Her trauma outweighed her ability to go on the record, which was really a shame in the end. And even though, as a reporter who at the time I had, the whole backing of the Columbia University School of Journalism behind me to help me, to say, if you go on the record, that's actually more protective for you than being anonymous. And, here are some whistleblower resources for you. None of that was really enough to get her to the finish line. And I still think about her a lot. And I think that, and I don't know if my other panelists have this experience, but, the people that we interact with, they have real lives, and we're trying to tell their story at the end of the day. And, like Jane Marie said, they are human beings. And, the whole point of doing what I was doing was trying to help, not just her, but to help other people like her. And so I think that doing as much research as you can to understand how to interact with people who have been traumatized is ultimately going to be more beneficial than not, for this sort of thing moving forward. So that's my personal opinion and belief on it when it comes to my journalism.
Can I bounce off of this? And I want to have this discussion. So I think that part of the reason they're not open with us and don't want to talk to us very openly is because we speak about it like we need to come in and help, like I'm here to help you. Like you're in a pickle and I'm gonna try to come get you out. How do you get around that? Like just tell me about your life, and like I'm not gonna, it's really hard for me. That's a thing I'm challenged by all the time, is not like talking down or making it sound like somebody's done something wrong right off the bat.
Yeah, for me with this one person, I actually found her on Reddit on some anti-MLM threads, and we built a relationship from there. And, I spoke to the Columbia University School of Journalism has the Dart Center for Trauma, which I think is a great resource for anybody who's interested in learning more about this. And I spoke with the professor who runs that part of the school. And, he said, based on our interactions, this person is on a survivor's journey. And so I think it's just as much about where the victim or the former seller is coming from and what they are hoping to accomplish, as much as, we're trying to help as well. And sometimes those two things intertwine. And sometimes, like, obviously the other person has too much weighing on them in order for it to be ultimately successful. So that's kind of where and I totally feel you on the talking down aspect. Like, one of the best things that journalists can and should do all the time, which I think the pandemic has made infinitely harder, is to go out into the world and interact with real people. Sitting behind our computers and sitting at a desk all day is not going to, help us in terms of telling stories about the world around us, which is ultimately what we're in this business for, right? So that's what I think.
Okay, so I will move on to the next question. This is a little more social media focused. I would be interested to hear if anyone has thoughts on if there's a gender issue in terms of MLMs targeting females online. I know at least, I'm pretty sure most of you have spoken about this.
Yes. Yes, I think we all say yes.
Yeah, I think you've all spoken about this. Kind of increasingly with like young females on Instagram and social media. Kind of what have you seen? Yeah, what have you seen? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, as far as the aesthetics go, it's very clearly marketed towards women, the very Pinterest-esque type of color and font and the hashtags that are just so terrible, you know, boss babe and CEO. But I mean, that really, it really highlights the fact that these companies are targeting women in particular. I mean, we don't talk about gender when we refer to a man who is a CEO. He doesn't get him EO or something, you know, it's just they're male and business leader are synonymous. But when it comes to women, it somehow is like almost like, oh, isn't that precious, like you are a boss babe and isn't that exciting, and that gets really played up in the social media side of things, you know, preying on this idea that women do want to be entrepreneurs, they do want to contribute to the household finances, you know, they do want to have something of their own, but for some reason that's less important for them versus maybe their male partner, colleagues, or whatever it may be. So social media definitely plays into that, and it's pretty obvious, I think, in many cases.
I'll just say though, that is the community that folks are coming out of too, is like not just, and I don't want to speak for a bunch of people, but in our reporting, it's like making a brand around yourself when you live like in the middle of Michigan where I'm from, and your husband's the breadwinner and you're the one staying home with the kids. Like it's very appealing to have a brand like supplied for you, like to have like, okay, here's what it looks like. It's millennial pink with gold embossing and everything's in this calligraphy font. And this is your brand. And you can show this brand to your husband. You can show it to your recruits, your mom, your cousin, your whoever. And it's prepackaged and it looks professional. And maybe you've never, you know, you've been raising kids this entire time, which we all know is like, mine might come in any moment and I'll just kill the camera. But it's I think it's, yeah, obviously it's by design, but I think it's really appealing to people because it just adds this like polish immediately to, and I know that a lot of the companies have prescribed media strategies, social media strategies, where it's like, I think the last one I looked at was 7 posts a day, like 2 of them have to be personal, 2 of them have to be inspirational, and then 3 of them have to be product focused or something like that. But it gives structure, you know, and it looks and feels like a real business, even though you're losing money the entire time. I don't know.
Just to jump off of that, I saw there's something I've seen called like a comment blitz or like a post blitz, where people will friend strangers and then they'll kind of like periodically comment on your stuff to make you feel familiar with them. I see that. I posted wedding pictures a year ago and sometimes I'll just get random like so pretty and I look who it is and it's a person from X MLM, and you see they try to get you comfortable with them enough to the point where you feel like you know them, and then they reach out.
You said comment blitz though. I thought you were talking about how the companies organize a blitz where they like put a post out and then they have like all of their downline comment on this amazing new product, and really it's just people within the company.
Yeah, I've seen that too, a very coordinated effort of, or even just distributors with their team. Hey guys, I just put up a post, can everybody go like it? And you see once you start looking, it's a repeat of all the same people. Oh, I just bought this, or oh, I love that. Yeah.
I think another aspect of this that I wanted to jump in and talk about was it gives you the ability really to do your business from your phone for the most part, right? Because like that's where your social media lives, and like you don't need a whole bunch of like technology or whatever to start up and to do this properly. And I think that, you know, if we're talking about who is being targeted for recruitment, it's not just women. I think Bob Fitzpatrick told me about this. And from what I see here, at least in New York City, is that they're now increasingly targeting people of color and, you know, immigrants and people who may not necessarily be documented as like an easy way to, you know, make a living or make money, you know, when they legally may not be able to work in this country, because it's not something that I believe is really checked thoroughly. Correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a little bit since I've looked into that.
Right.
But yeah. Okay, yeah, great. So yeah, it's women, but it's also people who may not have the much other choice in terms of things that they can do to make money. And like, Jane Marie says, it looks legit and it's packaged professionally, and it makes them look like the real deal. So I think that also bears surfacing within this conversation.
As a like little coda to that, I've not met one person in an MLM that writes their phone off as a business expense. I've tried to get them to and say your cell phone is how you do work. I'm like, wait, what? Because it's not in the paperwork that you get from the MLMs, like cell phone usage.
Okay, so this question could be an entire conference in and of itself, but I thought you guys would be the most poised to answer. So if anybody would like to share a horror story that they have been given by any of their sources that they've spoken to, I know you all could give me probably a lot. So if everybody who's interested would like to just share kind of something that stands out to you that shows the kind of things that you become privy to once you get into this space of reporting on MLMs. Lisette, you want to start?
Horror stories. Two things come to mind. One is the source that I spoke about earlier, and the trauma that she endured. She was outside of the MLM, a victim of rape while she was selling. And at that point in time, she was so close to her her upline, who were very prominent in her area, that she confided in them, and she was basically told just to pour her angst and her pain into selling, which is so incredibly twisted, I think. And I hope that's not me being too biased or non-objective in witnessing that story, that, her telling me with like tears coming, down her face. And so I think that that's one possible way that more people are being traumatized by being a part of these organizations. And then the other is that I've spoken with people who are part of the class action lawsuit that's ongoing against Herbalife, and they're just people who have poured hundreds of thousands of dollars, being told that by spending more money, by doing this, by doing that, it's going to pay off, and it hasn't. And now they have nothing, or they've lost their houses, or they've lost their other businesses as a result. So hearing that pain firsthand is really powerful and really painful, and trying to translate that for a story is also something that can be difficult to impart the emotional gravity of. So I think those are the two I would go with.
It definitely sounds like it's both difficult, but also can be extremely influential in helping people understand. And I think even the community that kind of defines themselves as anti-MLM, sometimes I think people kind of get into the woodwork of just hating on it. But reading those kinds of stories really helps people to see how tragic some of these situations really are, and brings kind of a level of humanity back into it. Liz, would you like to share any
horror stories? I mean, the thing about John Oliver was we, as Jane Marie said, like, if it didn't happen on tape, it didn't happen. So we didn't shoot any of our own original footage. We just used archival of, CNBC's Herbalife piece, or Nightline's undercover investigation of Mary Kay, or whatever. So, I talked to people involved who had been former sellers or current sellers, but to a lot less of an intimate degree. I wasn't trying to get anyone on the record. We would just call people we featured to understand their story, make sure we were being accurate and fair and all of that. So I probably don't have any horror stories like everyone else. We heard a lot of very interesting things off the record that we were not able to substantiate because, we do those segments in just a few weeks. So I wish I could repeat those because they were extremely disturbing. Yeah, I mean, this isn't so much a horror story, but a confounding story. Was after the segment aired, well, actually, I think maybe it was one of our lawyers got reached out to, but anyway, got funneled to me. A high level person in the C-suite at one of the MLMs that I'd never heard of. It's not super popular. I think it's sold energy drinks. Wanted to like tell me about how they were different than everyone else we featured in the piece. And like, you really need to hear this because come on, that was so unfair. You included us with all these other ones and they're scammy, but we're not. Here's why. And it was so perplexing because as a journalist, when you get a call like that, or at least maybe this is just me, I'm extremely paranoid. You're like, oh my God, what did we do wrong? Like, tell me, what is it? And you're taking the conversation in good faith because you want to know, oh my gosh, I don't want to be unfair or inaccurate ever in my life. But we probably had like, in total, probably 4-hour conversations in which he was speaking in like this fluff, vague cloud speak of like never identifying anything that was inaccurate, never verbalizing, why their business was legitimate and, the way they were portrayed was unfairly. So it's not so much a horror story, but it was a very psychologically confusing story because you're beginning to question like, well, what is going on here? Does this person truly believe that? Is he trying to just convince me? And I think that was how we eventually ended it, was me just saying like, what exactly are you trying to get out of this? Like John doing a plug on the next episode being like, this one's a good one or something. And I think that finally ended things, but it was really surreal.
I want to just say one, like, this is some important language stuff that I keep want to come back to. The idea of a tragic story or a horror story, or and this isn't in response to you specifically, Liz, it was just like in the general thinking about this language and this question is I would say the main reason we don't as a country or as a world, like understand the gravity of these predators is because people aren't willing to come forward. And if we were to start talking about involvement with MLMs as more of a whoopsie, like a comedy, I mean, they are tragic, but the idea of like putting the idea of tragedy or huge mistakes or wow, it's just so awful what you did to yourself and your family, and instead like changing the language somehow around the victimhood, and that's another word that is problematic in reporting about this. I just want to do that so badly. I don't know how to do it, but I feel desperate to do it, where it's like it's very hard for people to self-identify as victims. Very, very hard in any area of psychology. It's really hard for people to say, I made a mistake. Something happened to me and it led me to a mistake, or someone victimized me because I'm a sucker or whatever. None of those things are true here. And I want to work so hard on changing the language. Like I made a oopsie or something.
I like how you keep things relatable, Jane Marie. And that's what's so great about your podcast. All right, Casey, I think that you might have something that you would like to share. So if you want to give us this.
Yeah, sure. Well, obviously I heard a lot of really disturbing things from the people I talked to, but one person I think about a lot was this one woman who was basically explaining to me what the final straw was for her, why she finally left the MLM, which wasn't necessarily one eureka moment, but kind of like a buildup of a couple of egregious acts by her so-called friends. And I think it really speaks to the danger behind this industry, not just financially, but also when you get into the health and wellness arena. And the pandemic, I think, has, accelerated that even more. But basically, she was a consultant for a very well-known and well-established MLM, And during the time that she was working with them, her mother was diagnosed with cancer. Obviously, a terrible thing to happen to anybody. And her upline suggested that she leverage that in order to make more sales. That's definitely not unheard of as far as strategies go. But she was essentially like, you need to put together a party essentially around this event in your life and encourage people to buy from you to support you during this terrible time. And as you can imagine, she was pretty taken aback by that suggestion. And the other one was, and I think this really was the final straw, she has a very dangerous blood clotting disorder that she takes medication for. And one of her friends who sold essential oils, not surprisingly, it's always the oil babes, suggested that she replace her medication with a particular oil. And she told me, if I did that, I would die. I would literally die. So, you have these consultants, distributors who are going around not just, getting people to participate in a financially questionable venture, but also making some really scary health claims and recommendations based on these products that don't do what they believe that they do. So that's my horror story.
Actually, off of what you just said, I don't know if you guys have seen that episode of Unwell, the show on Netflix.
Yep.
I remember that the person, when she was a little girl, she had like a potential brain tumor, and the mom decided to treat her with essential oils, and they had to kind of hide it from the doctors because they were concerned about Child Protective Services finding out. And now she sells oils, and that to me, like, it's really sad, just the situations of desperation and how, but I do think that episode is good at kind of portraying those stories. So we only have a couple minutes left, but I would love to hear quickly your perspectives on how your work has been perceived, including if you've gotten any certain kinds of backlash. I know some of you are disappointed at the lack of lawsuits that you have been subjected to, but just in general, what kind of feedback do you get, and does that include backlash, positive? Liz, do you want to go first?
Sure. So we released the episode, as I said, the Sunday before the 2016 election. And I feel like, I wish the timing had been different, because I do think part of the reach of the episode, or the conversation dialogue that could have happened after it aired, would have been different if, there hadn't been the election. That was a huge surprise for many, or according to the polls. So I don't really remember, what kind of, I don't believe that we got any backlash. I do, this is super stupid. It's like my Facebook page, but I did post it on my Facebook page. And a lot of people were like, that's awesome. Oh, I'm going to share this. I hate, my cousin's always bugging me about this. I'm going to post this. But I did get a really nasty comment from a source who a story I'd worked on like 10 years before. And, never kept in contact with him after that. He friended me on Facebook at some point, I guess. I didn't even remember, but he commented, like, similar to the guy from the company that called us up. He's like, whatever about this piece you did, but how dare you include this one company that my wife works for? And, that company is not like all these other companies, and it's given her an amazing opportunity to, run her own business. And she, all the stuff about maternity leave and having her own career and blah, 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 with how wrong I was and how like snobby we were and this and that. And, I responded and said, actually, you can look up their income disclosure statement on their website. Here's how to do it. Here's what it says, which, is over 90% of people have never received a paycheck. I sent that to the company to make sure I was understanding it accurately and to make sure we weren't being unfair or missing any context. They did not respond, and kind of just like laid it out there neutrally. So obviously that's a sample size of one, but I think it just shows kind of how personal this can be and how wrapped up in someone's identity this sort of stuff can get, that they would take that, if someone attacked the New York Times, which they do all the time on Facebook, I'm never like jumping in to defend, because who cares, like there's, why get in a Facebook fight with someone? But I think it was interesting to see like how, wrapped up in their identity this attack was.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Steve Hassan will be speaking, probably will mention that. He has a lot to say about that kind of concept of identity enmeshment and how people get very attached to the MLM. We only have a couple minutes, so Lisette, if you want to quickly give a short.
Sure, yeah. So the Rodan and Fields piece that I mentioned, which came out last fall, people, I was hearing good things. People enjoyed it. They were, glad I'd written it. But a source sent me screenshots of a internal Rodan and Fields seller Facebook group where people were bashing me. They were bashing the piece. They were, saying I was wrong. And there was like an official statement from the company that they weren't to, publicly engage with either me or the story on social media. And I think that kind of rings true with a lot of what my colleagues here have said about their different experiences with MLMs, just like not being responsive to their questions. They just tend to ignore it. But it was eye-opening just to see that there is this undercurrent of, people seeing it, reacting to it, but you don't really know about it unless someone gives you, a secret passageway to see that that's going on. So even if you're not hearing anything, it's probably just because you're not privy to it, at least online.
Okay, Jane Marie.
That was my experience, is that, that a lot of the companies we covered were told not to acknowledge that we did anything. But I did still get all of the same misogynist comments I get on anything I do. About the way my voice sounds, how I yelled at someone I shouldn't have, like how I lost my cool in moments. But no, not much from the sellers, I don't think. Yeah, I think they were told not to ignore it. Kind of didn't happen.
And Casey, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I was really surprised by the positive feedback that I got from my own friends and colleagues, people who normally I don't think really pay too much attention to the stuff I'm writing about, credit scores and all that junk. But when I touched on MLM, it seemed to really resonate with a lot of people. And a lot of people were like, my mom's involved in this and it's really messing up the finances and it's straining her relationship with my dad and all this crazy stuff. So it definitely touched on something that I think affects many more people than we might even realize, because it normally isn't part of popular conversation or something that people generally want to talk about. But in private, they had a lot to say.
Okay, and now I think it is time for our Q&A.
Okay, I'm Dr. Stephen Barrett, a retired psychiatrist who's been looking at MLMs for more than 40 years. We actually didn't get too many questions on this segment, but I will cover some that we did. One question was, have any of you who have reported on in a critical way on MLMs ever felt personally threatened or attacked?
I expected to at first. The only time I ever felt very weirded out by the actions of an MLM as a reporter was after I attended that Herbalife recruiting event in Queens. I had to opt out and leave halfway through because I wouldn't commit to being a distributor on the spot, even though they knew I was a reporter. And I think a week and a half later, I got a phone call from California, and it was the VP of public relations or communications at Herbalife. Like a vice president literally reached out to me to be like, hey, do you have any questions? What's going on? And I have no way of absolutely knowing, but in my mind, there had to have been a connection between the fact that I was the fish that got away at an Herbalife event when they knew I was a reporter, and then I got a call from this person. So I felt like I was being watched a little bit after that, I'll have to say.
Other than Joe Mariano inviting himself into my office and then just spending 2.5 hours yelling at me and my co-host about how we're wrong about MLMs, I haven't had personal attacks. But I also chalk that up to like a little bit of misogyny. Like people don't take what we're doing seriously. But yeah, having this man in my office, I'll send you the episode, Stephen, of this guy just kind of screaming at me about how dumb I am. I haven't really experienced anything online like that.
In response to your surprise that, or whatever your feeling was about not getting feedback from the top of the company while you're doing the story, one person commented that virtually all MLM companies have strict policies against their independent distributors representing the company to the media. I guess the question was whether this also says something about the company itself. And my speculation is that they don't want to speak to you for the same reasons defendants who are guilty are advised not to take the stand. They don't want to engage you. They don't want to open anything up. They hope that the story will be less readable. But
anyway. I think you're correct in that. It wasn't just the independent distributors that said no to us. It was everyone, like on every level in the companies that really didn't want to speak, didn't want to acknowledge that we were doing this reporting, didn't want to go on the record for anything. I'm sure that was other folks' experience too.
Okay.
Yeah, same here. And that is really unusual. Like most PR flacks want to talk to you off the record just to hear what you know. Like they want, so then they can tell their boss, like, okay, a reporter from X is contacting me. Here's what they know, you know, here's what we can do. Even if they'd like then come back to you and say, we're not going to participate, no comment. So yeah, it wasn't just obviously independent distributors. You could kind of understand they don't want, you know, real companies all the time tell employees, you know, if you get contacted by the press, send it to us. So that's more understandable.
Yeah, well, maybe that says something about the nature of these companies, that they're not like other companies. Okay, question. How do you think we can get the general public to realize how much of an issue MLMs are?
Reduce the shame around being involved in one, get people to come forward more with being a victim of a scam. I think that's what it is, and not treat people like suckers. That's very broad, I understand, but I think reducing the shame around even having been involved in the first place will allow more people. And you know what? I think it's happening. I think it started with Liz. I think like the more of us who are talking about it, more people are coming out of the woodwork and saying, oh yeah, I kind of got scammed too. And I'm not going to feel embarrassed about it. And I'm going to let people know that this thing happened. That's all I can do because I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really just about having conversations just like this. Because up until a few years ago, like I said, nobody really talked about it. And so, you know, I was in the dark about it for the most part, and I'm sure most people were also. So I think we just need to continue the conversation. Like Jane Marie says, you know, make it just like a normal conversation. You know, in the personal finance industry, there's a lot of shame and guilt there too. And as a reporter, I think empathy should always be the number one thing that you operate with, always keeping that front of mind. Even when people do some questionable things, you know, we're all human, we all make mistakes, we all get tricked by large corporations in some way or another. So just having real conversations with people, I think goes a long way.
I think also it helps to, I think a lot of people in power don't take this industry that seriously, or they used to not, and now this is changing because everyone's great work. But it's seen as kind of like small potatoes. Oh, okay, so a bunch of people are losing like $40 or $100, and it's not like this hugely devastating, most of the time, you know, singular financially devastating experiences for an individual. Like at large, it's, the stories aren't as clean as, you might expect. And I think that that's really a shame. I think that like there's entire predatory industries based on like small fees that, eat up $8 at a time from individuals. And like, that's not okay. And people get pissed off about that and laws change. So I think what would really help is just like, again, focusing on the scale and the scope of this industry. I believe it's multi-billion-dollar. Last time I checked, I remember we were trying to compare it to like, it's bigger than movie revenues, or, like this is not nothing. Regulators and people in power take this seriously.
Up until a couple months ago, like half of them were in the cabinet though, who like ran these companies.
Well, but
so it's really hard to, and the FTC was gutted and doesn't have any funding. And so,
for sure,
yeah.
But even we did our segment back in 2016 when Obama was president, and the FTC was, Edith Ramirez and blah, blah, different people. And, they did an investigation of Herbalife and got the books and did a full audit and basically called them a pyramid scheme and proved they were a pyramid scheme, but didn't say it in the freaking paperwork. And like, I didn't make that decision. It may be defensible, but like, I think that actually really matters. And that like, I don't know, I don't think it's like necessarily like corruption or greed or like that cartoon character, like political problems. It's just like a lack of courage. I don't know. I'm not to go off on regulation here, but
yeah.
I mean, I think that what everyone was saying, like, it's just this undercurrent of shame. And I don't know if it's a uniquely American thing where our shame is being used against us in so many different ways. But I think that it's used by your uplines, like while you're in, and I think it's used by your friends and family when you're in and when you're out. And so it's almost like a no-win situation for the people who are in. And, I think the other thing, what Liz was saying about the regulations and FTC, because they came so close to calling Herbalife a pyramid scheme, but they didn't quite tip over the edge. And because there's still some gray area legally around it, people kind of throw around the term pyramid scheme, Ponzi scheme, without actually really knowing A, what it is, or B, like misusing it. So, I'm sure other people have seen distributors say, oh, I'm a boss babe and I have my own business, and your company that you're working for that pays you every 2 weeks and gives you benefits is a pyramid scheme. Like it's almost like used as like a counterattack in like this almost like Trumpian sort of way, not to bring the past 4 years into the conversation, but I think that there's a lot of psychology at play with this, which I'm sure, like Sarah said, Steve Hassan has a lot of experience with, and we'll speak to more, but it's definitely there.
And so the task of the journalistic community might be, how can we show the public that this is a predatory industry? Not whether it's legal, not whether it's legitimate, but whether it's predatory. Mm-hmm. And apparently, you like to have your story decorated with a big victim. How about just doing stories on where experts advise people to stay away?
Are you talking to me?
Anybody.
That's not my show.
the world, the media. This was not exactly a question, but since I have the mic, I'm asking.
Yeah. No, we got mad at the industry, and there wasn't one big victim. Yeah.
I'll jump in here. I think because the basic story structure of journalism asks for a main narrative thread, asks for a protagonist. Sometimes we call them characters, depending on, what kind of newsroom or program or outlet you're working for. And it gives the story emotional weight and resonance and helps connect with people. Experts are obviously great. And there's a lot of people here who are experts who all of us have talked to for, at various points for different stories. But I think that culturally, we're obviously seeing a shift away from expertise. And so I think the mix of having experts, but also having people tell their personal stories and giving that human element makes it more understandable, rather than somebody kind of getting up on their soapbox being like, don't do the MLMs, you know, like, I think it's both.
Okay. Another question. Have you noticed any associations between MLMs and specific religious groups? This question was based on the idea that several people have commented on the similarity between MLMs and cults. So have you seen any associations with specific religious groups? Is that a industry-wide or whatever?
Anyone
I don't
else?
know about specific correlation, but they definitely leverage people's religion in order to emphasize the importance of the MLM. You know, I've seen a clip of the head of Plexus quoting scripture and essentially telling the distributors that were there that selling Plexus products is an assignment from God. So take that information as you will. There's definitely a relationship between the two.
I think we're going to be talking in other sessions about the economy here too, because the majority of MLMs are female-focused products. They are recruiting women, and I think a lot of them see religious communities as kind of sitting ducks, like folks who by choice maybe don't have upward mobility, or they're stuck home with the kids, and that's just kind of like the perfect place to pitch something. So it's a chicken or the egg kind of thing, but I think that the egg was designed to trap a certain audience.
Okay, another question, how do you decide which MLM to cover? Or how did you decide?
Oh, then whatever one's cracked me up. I don't know. Anyone else? Or did the most damage?
For me, it was just running into this guy on the street handing out Herbalife leaflets, and then going into his nutrition club and realizing that for a big corporation that this place was, I hate to say it, it was run down. It was not well taken care of. The signs were written in hand, by hand, and like, you know, magic marker, like just seeing the disconnect between a big brand and then this is like the physical representation of the brand was weird enough for me to keep going into it. But like, I think it doesn't matter which MLM you come into contact with first, because A, they're all so similar, and B, like once you learn the basics of how one works, you understand how they all work for the most part, and then you can continue to cover other companies, because, you know, it doesn't matter what they're selling, the basic structure and the basic story is always going to be the same.
Okay, just 1 second. Had a whole bunch of questions come in all at once here. Have you looked at, are there any general trends you've seen and what happens to people after they leave MLMs?
I've seen people join other MLMs, unfortunately, in our reporting, like kind of go away and then come back to the idea. But yeah, a lot of reporting.
Okay. Another question, despite all the negative experiences reported in the media and online, why do you think people continue to join?
I think there's a sense of desperation with the pandemic, at least. So we've noticed at Forbes that anything we've written about stimulus checks gets a ton of traffic and a ton of attention. And, you know, this was before the pandemic, growing income quality across America. Like, I think that there's just that, like, undeniably, I would call it a human desire to have enough money to, you know, live, you know, the American dream. And I think that's kind of what a lot of these companies are trying to sell, for better or for worse. I don't know if anyone else has anything to say about that.
Well, and I think a lot of studies have shown that people rely heavily on friends and family for their news and recommendations and basically life choices. So, for every news story that's out there, if you have 5 friends or family members that are telling you otherwise, I think a lot of people are inclined to believe them over the media.
It's also the lottery mindset. You don't win any lottery, you don't play. And there's been many studies done about the way people view the opportunity to make money in an MLM. And there's some folks who look at the income disclosure statements and go, I'll be that $1 million person at the top of the list. And then there's the most people go, wow, these don't look so good. But it's not that different from getting a scratch off ticket, which I'm guilty of probably every week.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left. Probably one more question. Do you have any opinions as to what social media companies are doing or should be doing to protect users from MLMs?
Well, they first have to be blanket illegal so that you can take them down, right? Don't we have to make them violate some law?
Now, the Facebook is a private company and can do anything it pleases.
Sure,
There may be political backlash, but it doesn't have to be illegal. It can be inaccurate or a whim. Of course, they're conservative. I guess the people who asked wondered if you had any opinions as to what you thought the company should do.
Yeah, I wish that all of the big media companies had different agendas, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, to jump in here, I used to be a social media manager before I became a reporter. And so, my experience is that they don't, and we know this based on what's gone on with, Twitter, kicking people off permanently like Trump. They don't apply their policies and their terms of service evenly across user base, right? So for us to recommend them do anything about, MLM content, that would require them to make sure that they're doing everything about, political extremism and white supremacy and racism and harassment and trolling, and they're not doing that evenly. So I feel like those are even bigger asks, and probably, I hate to say it given the topic that we're talking about, but they're probably more important at this point in time to be controlled as opposed to the MLM type of content, which I think really lives in a gray area. And I'd be curious to hear, what my fellow panelists think about that.
I mean, I agree that it's not at the top of the list right now. If we can't get rid of white supremacists on Facebook, I feel like I don't know, blow horns. Those don't even work. How would we get them to care about these ads?
Okay, our time is
Yeah.
up, I think.
So there will be a facilitated discussion for attendees from 4 to 5 p.m. So for those of you who want to stick around, we will be back in 10. Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks to all of our panelists. Bill?
I just want to step in and thank this panel in particular. I have been talking to journalists about this for more than 20 years. And what has changed is 20 years ago, I would get a call from some journalist for some newspaper somewhere, and they would want in 10 minutes for me to tell them what's going on with that company, in their town. In the last 20 years, what we have done is gotten calls from people like you who have taken the time as part of your journalistic career and as part of the quality of the publications you're working on to really dig in. And so that has actually broadened the narrative and brought stories forward more nationally, brought a broader set of stories forward. And I just want to compliment you on that and thank you. Some of you I've interacted with personally. There are other journalists out there. Robert Fitzpatrick has done it. Stacy has done it. Many of us have talked to the journalists, and the quality of the questions, the quality of the reporting, the breadth of the reporting. I just want to say I appreciate it.
I appreciate you, Bill.
Thanks. I will be back on at 4 o'clock, and we're going to do I'm going to move the attendees. I've never done this before, attendees. So if you're hanging around, I'm going to move you into a panelist mode so you can ask questions. I have no idea how we're going to facilitate, 150 to 200 people, but what the heck, why not? We'll try.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.